Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Take. This is episode number 16. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be hosting for you today. Joining me on the line, keeping down the Eastern Front, we have both of the boys, Teld and Chris. We just sat through a 30-minute story of how Chris beat up a barn owl and tossed it out of his window.
He swung first.
I'm sure clips of, we started recording, we're like, let's get into this episode, and Chris was like, no, wait a minute, I got this story about being attacked by...
I hope it was worth it. I should have taken a picture of the owl when he was in my car after I, stunned, completely and totally, incapacitated him, because, I feel like the story is not believable, and I, need a photo as proof. But I was just so freaked out, it, didn't even occur to me to document it, so...
Further proof that nothing good happens after midnight.
No.
Yeah.
I can't be helped if certain bits of that end up at the end of this episode, because we did start recording before you told that story, so we'll see. I was like, maybe I can just put this as the outro, but then it was 25 minutes. I was like, okay, maybe we just take out all the parts where Chris was doing benevolent stuff and just make it sound like he was murdering a barn owl.
Yeah, we can leave out the fact that I was giving a homeless dude a ride.
Yeah, no, we don't need to talk about that part. That makes you sound good, Okay, so today we are actually going to expand on our Build a Cube series that we started back in January. If you want to listen to part 1 of this series on just basic cube parameters, that's episode number 12. We recorded it mid-January and reserve the right to expand this series as we see fit. I think we want to distance ourselves between individual episodes so that it feels kind of natural for us to record, but we are going to at least go up to about 4 episodes of this series and maybe even expand it beyond that if we find topics that add on to it. But the Build a Cube series is here for novice cube designers and to a lesser extent experienced cube designers who just kind of want to cross-compare how they do things with how people like us do things. But for the most part, this is a series that's here to get first-time cube designers ready to go and get them in the best position they can to make a good cube for whatever community they're going to be drafting with. The topic for this episode is going to be archetype design and density, which will expand on what we mean by both of those things. Before we get into the episode, I do want to go ahead and shout out our Discord server. The Jank Diver Gaming Discord is the best place on the internet to come talk about cube-related stuff. I mean, I assume it is. I don't know all the different cube-related places you can talk on the internet, but we've got a lot of people joining up who are just here to draft cube, and we've got a nice little group of regulars who we found out yesterday have very strong opinions about vintage cube.
Yeah, if you come join us and we yell at you and call you insane, I apologize in advance. We don't mean it. We don't mean offense. We're just
was
we're
there
very
a
passionate.
heated discussion about vintage cube?
We had about 4 or 5 people in chat who were just, they were all day yesterday. We were just all BSing about Magic. And someone did come in and had what I would say are some pretty hot takes about vintage cube.
What kind of takes? Blade Splicer's the best card in the cube or something?
No, I think the biggest hot take was that Time Walk is not in the top 15 of playable cards in Vintage Cube.
And I want to say to the person who was actually presenting these, it's that is perfectly okay to have your opinions about stuff. People disagreed. I think people were maybe even a bit too harsh with the way that they were reacting to what he was saying, but they were some pretty hot takes that were kind of out of the ordinary. But I'm of the opinion, hey, if you have your hot takes, throw them out there if it works for you. That's the cool thing about Vintage Cube, is if you have a style that works for you and gets you trophies, it doesn't really matter what other people refute about your opinion. But
it also happened to be that the three of the people were me, Doug, and Drix, who all happened to be a bit exaggerated in some of our takes when we have hot takes.
Yeah. So this person maybe got panned a little bit unnecessarily for their takes, and apologies to that guy. But Jank Diver Gaming is a great place to come have opinions about things. No, we usually talk about retail limited. We don't actually talk about Vintage Cube that much, but whenever it's up, people are streaming, doing things like that, so people get a little bit heated. And it did get a little bit heated yesterday, but that's not the main topic here. We're talking cube design. I feel like I've been prattling on about this intro here, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and pass this along to you guys to kind of introduce our topic and what we mean when we're talking about archetypes and density and where we plan on going with this episode.
So the first episode, as Tim mentioned, was kind of thinking about like the parameters that you want to set for your cube, like how you kind of want it to play, et cetera, et cetera. So this episode is going to be more focused on what I would call a traditionally designed cube, you know, where you want to build sort of like the various colors doing like aggro, mid-range, control, combo. We're not going to talk a lot about combo because it's not something we do. We're going to be focused on sort of aggro, mid-range, control. And just real quick, it's really common, and I'm not criticizing this because it's just so like ingrained in the community, but I just want to clarify between like archetypes, which we're going to be talking about, and themes. So often what we would call a theme here at Jank Diver Gaming will be called an archetype, like the limited, like in a set, the limited archetypes in our view are actually themes. So like an archetype is a macro strategy, like we mentioned, aggro, control, mid-range, combo, and a theme is kind of like a sub-strategy within an archetype, like spells matter, or ninjas, or tokens, or something like that. But when you like really boil down what that theme is doing, you know, like in a Spells Matter deck, you can have a very aggressive Spells Matter deck, or you can have like a controlling Spells Matter deck. So Spells Matter doesn't really fundamentally tell you like what kind of sort of like matchups and CMCs and things like that in the individual deck. So we're going to be talking archetypes today, not themes.
Yeah, and even something that you might predict to be more telling, something like ninjas, for example, would obviously require you to attack, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an aggro deck. It frequently does, but if you played a lot of Neo Kamigawa, a lot of the ninja decks you would play were doing things like putting a virus beetle back into their hand to grind value, right? So you can have these sort of value-oriented decks that even if they require attacking, right? They don't necessarily have to be aggro just because you're attacking.
Yeah, and themes usually also ties into your gold section, your multicolor section, right? That's where you say, oh, well, the blank color pair is this theme. As Chris put it last time we recorded this episode for our old podcast, themes flavor your archetypes. So you have your archetypes first, and then you have your themes within your archetypes. What we are focusing on for this episode is monocolored sections, because that's how you build out your themes. And then our next part of this series, part 3, will very likely be gold design and building out themes from the archetypes that you have here. So the structure of building your cube in this series is start with your parameters. You know, basically, what do you want to achieve with your goal? That's episode 1. This one is building out your monocolored sections using the density experiment that Chris is going to walk us through a little bit later. And then once you have your monocolored sections built out, you can see where your themes develop from those, which is what we're going to talk about in the third iteration of this series. But today it's all about the monocolored sections and how to make sure the archetypes are present within your cube, at least the main archetypes, the rock, paper, scissors ones like aggro, control, mid-range.
Yes. It's important to remember as well that we are talking about what we would call traditional cubes. So this is going to be just kind of a good stuff cube. If you are using more of a novelty cube, a lot of times these themes are going to be a little more present as opposed to more of your good stuff cubes where they kind of occur emergently as opposed to being a part of the ground up design.
Right. So, obviously, if we're talking so in depth about the archetypes, we should probably go over what the major archetypes are, or at least if your whole goal is just to build a functional cube that kind of matches player expectation for a cube, and you're not coming in with like super thematic ideas in mind, these are the archetypes that you should be trying to support, or at least the ones that we would like to support in cubes that we design. And I should also say, as a caveat to that, if you already have like very specific themes in mind for your cube, like you're coming in saying, oh, I really want a blue-black ninjas deck, then you probably aren't going to get a lot out of this episode because you're looking for a very specific kind of design, whereas we're kind of going for open-ended cube design that's going to kind of lead to emergent themes from whatever cards you put in your monocolored section. But the major archetypes, obviously you have aggro, right? Aggro is, creatures that want to attack and kill your opponent, and you want to end the game as soon as possible and kind of strand your opponent with cards in hand. aggro is maybe a little nebulous. It can refer to like a burn deck. It can refer to like a Gruul Stompy deck or something like that. Basically, your whole deck plan is to try and give up your late game in favor of pushing an early game as soon as possible. And you see that often in the Mardu color pairs, though you could have like a blue aggro deck depending on the structure of things. But we find it's primary in the Mardu color scheme, at least in the arena card pool.
All of these archetypes are kind of dependent on like the context of your cube, right? So if like your cube is like 7 drops dot deck, like your quote unquote aggro deck like might start on turn 3. I think like a good way to define an aggro deck is that like pretty much always you are going to be like the proactive player. Like in almost all of your matchups, right? Maybe that's like a good way to define 10,000 foot view what aggro is.
If you wanted to compare this to retail limited, in cons, a lot of times your aggro decks started on 2 or even turn 3 sometimes, just like your mid-range decks did. They just had a different set of cards to enable them, as opposed to something like, I was going to say Phyrexia all be 1, but that's just all 1-drops. Maybe a better example would be like LCI, where like the aggro decks are playing 1-drops and the slower decks are not. But 1-drops, I think, are the defining feature of aggro. If you're not interested in playing a number of 1-drop creatures, you're probably not an aggro deck, but in like a traditional cube space. But it can differ.
That's a good point, that aggro can scale to the environment. Like the aggro deck is always the deck that's the most aggressive. It's trying to push the damage the earliest, but that doesn't necessarily mean it always gets started on turn 1. It's just in traditional cubes, your 1-drops are usually the defining feature. But control decks, whatever a control deck is in the modern era, it's the opposite, right? A control deck is a game that's trying to leverage dealing with things in the early game and extend the game as long as possible. It's usually the deck that has the most inevitability. We usually associate it with blue, counter spells, things like that, but a lot of colors can play a control game. Usually it's your ability to interact with what your opponent's doing and keep them off of their play, and that makes you a control game.
I do think particularly, it's not as true in the arena space, but inside of the maximized card pool, I do think blue is basically a necessary component to playing control, because the more you scale up the power of Magic, the more you start introducing extremely powerful cards that are only interactable on the stack. And outside of something like Mana Tithe or Reprieve, there aren't a lot of ways for other colors to interact with it. So those blue counter spells are extremely important to deal with something like, for example, a Show and Tell or a Reanimate or something like that.
Yeah, they're going to start printing counter spells in green pretty soon. So like blue literally has nothing left that only it does.
Cantripping green.
We already get better counter spells in white, but that's not for today.
Yeah, like green 1, counter target spell, draw 2 cards, put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield.
What a wild time we live in. There are some people out there who do not really want control elements in their cube. What do you say to that? I feel like you should strive to have control elements in your cube, but there are people who dislike that play pattern or the idea of control in their cube often enough that they'll just kind of like not intentionally support it.
I think I've mentioned this before, but when you take away control, you really do start to make your cube revolve largely around Battlecruiser Magic, because what's going to happen is you're going to have these aggro decks, and you're going to have mid-range decks that prey on them, and basically what your players will inevitably do is find the biggest possible mid-range deck that doesn't lose to aggro. And you don't have anything that can go over the top of that biggest possible mid-range deck that doesn't lose to aggro other than the one that does. And, depending on your group, that maybe those aggro decks don't even show up. I think control is a necessary predator to take advantage, particularly like, for example, in our card pool, green is extremely powerful, but one of its biggest weaknesses is green is just unbelievably soft to like 2-mana counter spells. You to the point that like I think the control matchup is like 70-30 in favor of the control player, even if you're playing a very good green deck and a very mediocre control deck. So I think that's a good way of having natural predators to decks that would otherwise just go bigger than everybody else. One thing I do think cube designers need to be aware of is that cube control is just necessarily going to look different than a modern control deck. You don't have the density of effects like Sunfall and Wrath with like Memory Deluge and effective Planeswalkers to consistently create that sort of creatureless control that we normally associate. So you want to make sure that your control decks exist, I think, but you want them to be incentivized to play some number of creatures, if nothing else, as blockers.
Yeah, that's a good way to wrap everything on control. I would say control is like on a downswing these days, but if you're building a cube, a traditional cube, you should still go out of your way to make sure it's there because it is a necessary part of that rock, paper, scissors dynamic, with mid-range, as you mentioned, being one of the other key archetypes. Mid-range is, again, another fairly nebulous term, but it basically just means everything in between. There are hard aggro decks that all they want to do is 10 out of 10 times play 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop attack. And then there are hard control decks that are like playing one finisher and a bunch of counter magic, stack interaction, sweepers, and removal. And then anything that's in between on that gradient is basically a mid-range deck. It's incorporating elements of basically aggro and control, and it's somewhere in between them. As Teld pointed out here in our notes, everything is mid-range, There is another big archetype here, which is combo, like big C combo, not like, oh, these two cards just happen to work well together, but actual like splinter twin situation type combo, A plus B equals I win the game. That is not something that we necessarily support in our cubes. I do not think it is a necessary part of, like, if you're trying to replicate the vintage cube experiment, like, it does not necessarily have to be in there. It's just something that people come to expect in the really, really high powered environments. I will say it's a little bit weird when people build cubes and there's like one single A plus B splinter twin style combo in it, because that deck, whatever the combo is operating on like a completely different axis than everything else that's in the environment. So I would say if you're a combo supporter and you want combo represented in your cube, you should make sure that is very clear with the people you're drafting. Like if you just go to like a bar and you're drafting your cube with some friends who have never cubed with you before, you should probably mention, hey, there are splinter twin style combos in here. And B, you probably should have like multiple avenues for combos so that it's an expected thing throughout different matches instead of just a oops, I got paired against the person who has a 2-card combo that wins the game. I find it personally very strange when people just have like Kiki Jiki splinter twin style stuff, and that's like just the only combo that they have in an entire 450 card cube or something.
Yeah, like an example, and you really should have it, because like otherwise your combo deck comes down to like whether or not you drew like the right 2 cards on your own. Like for example, in like a red-black reanimator deck in Vintage Cube, like Sneak Attack is also a card you might want to play because you're already playing giant things for reanimation. And Sneak Attack like operates on a similar axis where it's just like cheating out giant stuff. So if you have like a basically like a cheat kind of combo in your cube, like there should be a variety, like A plus B or A plus C or A plus D all kind of do the thing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and then you have to be careful because combo typically operates on such a different axis that a lot of the traditional ways you interact with them don't really work. So for example, in like Vintage Cube, even though Gristlebrand is no longer the premier finisher, for a long time it was. And one of the things that was really frustrating about that card is that if you weren't in a spot where you could just kill them off of it, there wasn't a lot of counterplay, even if you had the removal to once the Gristlebrand was in play to pay 7 life, draw 7 cards. These days you can kind of do things like just kill them or whatever, but you kind of needed the graveyard hate or the counter spell to stop them from burying you in card advantage. One other thing that I would recommend here is be very, very careful. Modern card text, there's a lot of text on cards, and it's sometimes accidental combos can come up. So for example, when we added Rosy Cotton to the Peasant Cube, we had to take out Scurry Oak because those 2 cards individually are both very fine cards in the Peasant Cube, and we wanted to include both of them. But they create this sort of splinter twin style combo where Scurry Oak and Rosy Cotton go infinite together. And so we had to choose one or the other, and we decided we liked Rosy Cotton better, so we went with it. But those are sort of things that if you're not really paying attention can kind of get you. Peregrine Took is probably going to be a huge problem down the road for a number of different cards because it's just kind of one of those cards that you sneeze and it creates an infinite combo.
Support combo in your cube if you want to. Just make it like an actual visible part of the cube. cube if you're going to do that, and make sure that your rules of engagement are clear to the people drafting. So, what you don't want to do is trick people either, right? You don't want to do the thing where you play Pester Mite as just like a random card in your cube, but you don't have the Kiki Jiki combo because people are going to expect you to have that sort of thing. So just be conscious of combo. It comes with a little bit of extra like baggage attached to it. Some people love it. We're not personally a fan of it for our cubes, but that does bring us to these two mini sub archetypes, which I guess you could just call these archetypes. They're kind of like flavored versions of different archetypes, but we have tempo and ramp. We did an entire episode on tempo.
I don't think we should wade into defining tempo here.
No.
We'll just spend a shitload of time on it.
No, but it is something that this is kind of an archetype that emerges itself from having control and aggro elements, right? So if you have a control deck, you have an aggro deck, odds are you can combine the different pieces together to have a tempo deck. And then ramp, everybody knows what ramp means. It's mana acceleration, usually centered in green, though there are some weird instances where you can have ramp in other colors, depending on your access to like colorless ramp and stuff like that, especially vintage cube. But ramp is another subset that comes out almost primarily in green and is kind of like a defining feature of a lot of different cubes. I would say that we have a ramp deck in our unrestricted cube, and it feels distinct from other types of mid-range. So those are the main archetypes. Basically aggro, control, and mid-range with a couple different wrinkles that emerge from those things. But in order to have an effective traditional cube, you kind of do need the aggro, control, mid-range trifecta. It is really a rock, paper, scissors thing where if you remove one of those or you're intentionally not trying to have one of those, the other two end up just being completely rampant. It feels like you're throwing stones against walls during gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, and I wouldn't even necessarily, depending on like the way you design your cube, call it like strictly rock, paper, scissors. Like, that's kind of up to you in terms of like what tools you give each archetype. But the way Teld framed it earlier, I agree with, which is basically like, if you don't include one of these, then there may be fewer checks on one of them, like, which will ultimately result in it being the most consistently winning strategy.
For sure. We wanted to take a moment to kind of go over like a color hierarchy here, just go through all the different colors, your monocolored sections, and flesh out like what their primary roles are in a traditional cube with some secondary roles or support colors, like what they do best versus what they tend to support well. For example, white decks, if you're building a traditional cube, your white deck is almost primarily going to be an aggro deck. You're going to have your 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop creatures, maybe a 4-drop sneaks in, your efficient removal, right? And you're just going to have a traditional white weenie aggro deck. It's usually not going to be mono white. A lot of times it'll be like white black or white red or something like that. And it could be mono white, but you are primarily building out a white section as an aggro section. But you will also have support for mid-range with a couple like higher up, blink type strategies, things like that. And you will often have control support in the form of wraths, cheap, efficient removals, your things like swords to plowshares and Wrath of God and stuff like that. So white does the aggro thing, but is actually a fairly flexible color in modern Magic. I would say over the last couple of years, white has actually expanded what it does quite well beyond being just white weenie or bust, you know?
Yeah, and then there are a lot of just really solid 3 and 4-drop white cards in modern Magic. So I would say that white is probably in most traditional cubes like a secondary mid-range color. So primary support for aggro, secondarily mid-range, and then it's like tertiary support for control, where your control deck is going to largely be blue cards, but you're going to play a couple cards in your white section, assuming you think that this card type is like still good, which I believe at this point Teld does not. But you'll probably play like a small handful of wraths that are like explicitly control support, and then white has good removal, so like some of those removal spells are going to support your control deck as well. But you're never going to have like primarily white control deck in, as we keep mentioning, like a traditional cube environment.
Yeah. One of the things I've really enjoyed about drafting it in our kind of environment is I do think it's an excellent mid-range color. I think a lot of the really quality can play both ways kind of cards are in the white section. You get a lot of really good grindy tools that are excellent when you're ahead or behind, stuff like Wedding Announcement, Wandering Emperor, Sarah Paragon, that sort of thing. So I've really grown fond of drafting of heavy white decks. I think they're a really fun space to draft in because I feel like you get a lot of game decisions as well, which is not true of older white cards. I think these days white cards have a lot of play to them that was not true in the past.
Yeah, agreed. White's gotten a lot more interesting.
It really has. Like if we had recorded this 5 years ago, back in like 2019 or something, we'd probably say white is just an aggro deck that has a couple like sweepers. But they really have, like over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, 4 years or whatever, expanded what white does in Magic as a whole. And I think that's reflected in Cube. Is white, I guess white and black are probably like the most diverse colors in terms of like all the different things they can support. Black tends to do like a little bit of everything as well.
Green also does a little bit of everything, except it just does it better than everybody else. So there's that. But.
Yeah, green's cheaty face. Blue, as we mentioned, that's going to be like almost always your control color unless you're doing something very specific or very thematic. Primary and tempo as well. That's where your bounce spells and your like efficient interaction comes in, your memory lapse type cards. And you can support ramp and mid-range. Chris, I remember you talking about this the previous time we recorded it, so maybe you can expand on it, because it sounds weird to say that like blue is a support color for ramp and mid-range.
Yeah, so if you're playing like a primarily green-black mid-range deck and like the mana that's getting passed to you is like just good enough to support this, like you might put like Time Warp and Scarab God in your primarily green-black mid-range deck, for example. That's what I mean, like support for ramp and mid-range. Or if you're playing like Simic ramp, green tends to benefit from being paired with card advantage, although these days green just does card advantage on its own. But once upon a time, like running a really strong green core, but like having some blue cards in your deck, like Growth Spiral and like your 4-mana draw 2s that aren't like particularly strong anymore, or like Treasure Cruise or whatever. So once you have your ramp in place, you're drawing a higher density of stuff to do with all that mana. So with blue, generally, if it's a quote-unquote support color for ramp or mid-range, like you're probably like 80% some color and like 20% blue. So it really is like a minor support color for this deck, because generally speaking, you're not going to put like cheap flash creatures or counter spells in your quote-unquote mid-range deck.
I will say when you start to include the more powerful cards through Magic's history, a lot of them are expensive blue spells. And one of the best ways to break parity on a lot of these cards is to accelerate into them. Specifically, the one that comes to mind is Upheaval. If you have access to this card, this is where having an excess of mana is extremely powerful with an Upheaval, because you upheaval the boards and then you have a bunch of mana floating from all the dorks you just tapped, and you get to replay a bunch of your stuff. And so you break parity on this card and get a huge advantage, whereas your opponent just has to play a land and discard their hand.
Right. Or like opposition.
Yeah, opposition. In our cube environment, even stuff like Sublime Epiphany, I think if you can manage it, I think they are extremely powerful in like a green shell. I don't see it very often because I think it just doesn't play to what green is doing in our cube. But if the knobs were turned ever so slightly and we had a slightly different set of options available for blue-green, I do think those sort of big spell green-blue would be a legitimate contender in our cube.
Yeah, because like, first of all, Epiphany is expensive, right? So like ramping into it is good. But it's not uncommon in pure, like, very heavy blue decks. It's not uncommon to either A, not have like a creature to duplicate with it, where it's like still a good card in that situation. But sometimes you just won't have a creature to duplicate with it, or the one creature you do have out is like legendary or something like that, right? So yeah, I agree with you. Like in green, you're a lot more likely to have like a giant target.
Yeah, and we an example of this, we used to play a old alchemy card called Discover the Formula in our cube, which is like a 6-mana, draw 3, and then it reduces the cost of everything in your hand by 1, like perpetually, permanently. And that was the type of blue draw spell that would incentivize you to have green ramp sources in your deck, because you could ramp into it, recharge your hand, and then everything else is basically casting a bunch of lotus petals, right? You get this discount on all the cards in your hand, which green decks love. So that was a encouraging card to put you in like a blue-green ramp deck with blue support for that, but we don't play cards like that really anymore. So huge draw spells, big game warp and blue spells, those are the type of things that might encourage you to put blue cards in a green ramp deck, but it's not a primary blue strategy at all. You're not playing blue ramp, you're playing green ramp that has blue payoffs. Black is a very thematic color. Chris, do you want to go over this one?
Yeah, well, so it depends on the power level of your cube, right? Because like, if you're like in vintage cube, like the one black theme that's like there on power level is probably like Reanimator or Bust. Because I don't know how well like aggressively oriented sacrifice decks do in an environment that has like a bunch of powerful combo. But so traditionally, black has been like primarily a support color. Teld, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like historically in something like Vintage Cube, like you're very rarely going to play like an 80% black deck. Like black cards are in there for like hand disruption to combat combo, removal spells to combat aggro, sweepers for control if you want that kind of thing. So like black is, you know, a really heavy support color. So black aggro used to really suck because all of the 1-drops sucked. But they've been a lot more aggressive recently at printing like really high value black 1-drops like Knight of the Ebon Legion, Stalactite Stalker's really good. That Tiny Bones that's coming out in the next set looks super disgusting. So these days, not only do I think that black aggro is possible, but I think like depending on the matchup, it's like actively really strong. Like black aggro decks are insane against control decks because they just tend to have so many recursive cards. So at least in our cube, the primary archetype in black that sort of defines the color is aggro. And then obviously, as we mentioned, like it makes an excellent support color for mid-range or control decks. Like black is just maybe the best support color for mid-range decks because, like I said, it brings hand disruption, it brings removal. In the case of like Grave Titan, it brings like crazy finishers, Aquazats too in our own environment. So yeah, black is either like a support whatever your primary color is doing, and in our cube, if you're heavy black, you're probably an aggressive strategy at your core.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're noticing as we get more of these black creatures that are 1-drops that are just good on rate is the diminishing returns you get on recursive black creatures, because most of the time you really only need to draw one of them, because once you've got one, that's probably all you're going to be able to spend your mana on anyways. You're going to have other things to do. So I don't think, like, it's not common that you've got 3 recursive creatures sitting in your graveyard and you buy back all 3 of them, right? You usually buy back 1, maybe 2 of them. And so I think getting these cards that are just better on rate, a lot of which still have mana sink abilities, all 3 of the ones we mentioned that are going to be in the cube do, you know, Knight of the Ebon Legion's got the +3/+3 and so on. So, you know, they give you things to do with your mana, but they just like have this impact on the game that has to actually be answered. Because sometimes your opponent can just ignore the 2/1 hitting them in the face for like a turn or 2 and they play a blocker, and now you're in they play an X3 and you're just like, okay, well, I have no attacks until I draw a Blood Artist.
I 100% agree. Like, I think in Modern Magic, like, Gutter Bones just completely sucks. I mean, obviously, like, black aggressive decks, even if they have a heavy sacrifice theme, which ours does, like, ultimately, like, that's still a flavor of, like, trying to get your opponent dead. And frankly, these days, the recursive creatures that you really want in your deck that are actually, like, the recursion is acceptable on rate because the 1-drops tend to be, like, expensive to bring back too, are your 2-drops. Like Bloodghast and Skyclave Shade.
Yeah, I think Bloodsoaked Champion and Cult Conscript really stand out at 1 mana, but I think the other ones are pretty mediocre. Yeah,
like Dread Wanderer is not like it's not like this will be in the cube forever, but I do think it's better than like Gutter Bones. But yeah, there are a couple that are like cheap to recur. Actually, one of the awesome things about Bloodsoaked Champion is like if you have a Blood Artist effect and a sacrifice outlet, you can just attack even into like a blocked board with just Bloodsoaked Champion, and then you can just recur it as many times as you have mana for and re-sacrifice it. Like shit like that. Yeah,
you'll notice the Aristocrats theme is often tied to black, especially in Modern Magic. It feels like every set has the sacrifice theme going on in black, at least as a sub theme, and that's what we mean partially by black is very heavily thematic, is it often branches off into things like aristocrats and stuff like that.
I do think that's one of the biggest shifts in power when you move from like what I'm going to call like a mid-power environment like ours into the really, really powerful stuff. So legacy vintage cube type stuff.
You drop off that aristocrat stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Your black cards are very much just Thought Seizes, Doom Blades, and like these, aggressive, like really premium aggressive threats or really premium finishers. You drop the aristocrats, you pick up Reanimator.
Yeah, exactly. You supplement those or replace them entirely for a different type of thematic build, which is the Reanimator stuff. Which black also does really well in any environment that's not specifically the arena environment. Red is like maybe not the most interesting one to talk about, but red is obviously primarily your aggro color. Black can be an aggro color depending on what you want out of your cube, but red is pretty much always an aggro color. It's kind of...
If you're heavy red, If you're very red, you're probably aggressive.
There's a joke in the community about and I assume this extends to the Magic community abroad, that every red card is the same card, right? Like
they're not that far off. I mean, red does some interesting things these days, but it has not expanded in the way that white has. Whereas white can play like mid-range and control really well. Red kind of does that in a really binary way, where it's like red has burn spells, so red can play a control game because you can put a bunch of burn spells and kill your opponent's creatures. Also gives you a little bit of reach in those decks too, if you can send them up face. Red also has a couple fatties. It has some pretty chunky creatures these days, so you can support a mid-range deck. Yeah. Gruul is actually interesting because it could be like base green with red support, or it could be like base red with green support, or it could just be like an equal mix of the two. But Gruul is a good example of red as a support color. The point being here, though, if you're building a cube from scratch and you're building out your red section, odds are you're going to dedicate a lot of red space to aggro related stuff. Good 1-drops, good 2-drops, good 3-drops, and a lot of interaction. And red sections always kind of look very samey because you end up playing like 15 variations of shock, lightning strike, and whatever 3 damage burn spell you're playing, and it's just like, okay, red just has a bunch of things that deal damage, and it's not like the most exciting thing in the world, but that's what red does in Magic. So it's hard to avoid having a red section that's just full of burn spells without doing something that's like very thematic.
It also means red is one of the most reliable colors at showing up in our top tables when we're drafting, because just it's so easy to put red support cards into your deck, whether you're aggressive, controlling, or whatever. Whereas I think like a lot of times, you might go a while without seeing a deck with blue cards in it that's doing extremely well, and then like a blue deck will spike. But you don't really see that quite the same with the red cards. They're just very consistent, all reliable.
Yep. Moving on to green. Green in most traditional cube environments is primarily a ramp color. A lot of green sections are going to feature a bunch of dorks and then stuff to power out with those dorks. They can also be like mid-range cores where you don't need as many dorks. You're just like mixing with another color, and green has a lot of excellent stuff at like 3 and 4 that you can put into your, as Tim mentioned, like primarily red, like stompy deck. A lot of your like 2-drops are going to be like red 2-drops. Jund, as Teld just reminded me, Jund, features a lot of, in our environment, a lot of excellent green cards, including but not limited to a bunch of green gold cards, like Glissa Sunslayer, Bloodbraid Elf, things, Slimefoot and Squee, stuff like that just runs away with the game. Green, at least in our design, and I actually think that this is like broadly true throughout Magic, is like of all of the mono-colored decks, like green cards want to play with other green cards because you're like green top-end creatures tend to be the best top-end creatures, and green dorks help you play those early. So like it's not a great support color because most decks that are extremely heavily another color like aren't that interested in the mana dorks. And a lot of decks that are heavily one color don't want to play a bunch of 5 and 6-drop green creatures that they can't accelerate out.
I was gonna say when like the 5 best cards in your color are a bunch of cards that demand you have an untapped forest on turn 1, you have a bit of a situation with being a secondary color. And like, there's a reason that we cut Archmage's Charm and still run Archdruid's Charm, because it is much easier and more reliable to have a deck that can produce green, green, green than a deck that can produce blue, 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 even though both of those decks are usually base that color.
Yeah, think about those drafts where you start off really heavy in one color and you're trying to see what your pivot color is going to be. Like, you're 10 cards deep and they're all red cards. Like, what in green is going to entice you to start adding green cards to that pile of red cards? Not very much, right? If you're 10 cards deep and you're a blue control deck with a bunch of counter spells and a late game finisher, like, what in green are you adding to that pile that really bolsters that strategy? And the answer is usually ramp, but the ramp is so specific and requires you to warp towards an early game that a lot of times it's not really worth going into green to try and make that happen. So you usually either start out in green and build from there, or you're doing like some multicolor thing, but you rarely add green to another color as a support color because it just doesn't add very much. Even the removal is like Fights and Bites, which are some of the worst removal spells when you compare them to what removal looks like in other colors.
I was going to say, on top of that, a lot of the best green cards have heavy green pips. So Questing Beast, Doomscar Warrior, Battle Mammoth, Workshop War Chief, pretty much all the finishers require 2 to 3 green pips. So you're just not splashing these. So if you're looking to splash in the first place, like in your blue control deck, maybe you splash for something like a Mother Goose or a Sentinel of the Nameless City, but the number of cards that you actually can do that with are extremely small. And even Uro requires green, right? You're not putting an Uro in your deck if you can't reliably get green mana.
Oh, yeah, I am. You can't stop me.
Yeah.
I'm not putting Uro in my deck if I can't reliably get green mana by like turn 7 or 8.
I do want to say real quick on the green front, I was listening to an episode of Limited Resources. They were talking about I think they were doing a crack-a-pack for Vintage Cube or something, and LSV was talking about how in the Vintage Cube, it's no longer really ideal to do like a bunch of green Mana Dorks and a bunch of green top end, like your old Woodfall Primuses and Craterhoof Behemoth. That's kind of gone by the wayside. Like, that as green's primary strategy in like really powerful cubes is kind of not the real thing you should be doing anymore. It's really, if you're doing a ramp strategy, you're trying to ramp into a powerful 3 or 4 drop. You know, these game-winning cards like Fable the Mirror Breaker, Minsc and Boo, Lelia, which all happen to be red cards, but that's kind of like what green is morphing into, is more of a mid-range beat-down style deck that uses ramp to get the game-winning 3 and 4 drops on board a little bit earlier. And that hasn't quite reflected at our level. Like, I think we're still, there are decks that are still like, okay, I want to ramp into, what do we have, Tovolar's Huntmaster, Titan of Industry type cards. But as like the central theme of green throughout Magic's history, the kind of like cast 8-drop, 9-drop, 10-drop Ulamog type thing is not really what green is doing anymore, even in the ramp strategies.
Yeah, I think that's mostly a function, and part of the reason that we don't see it as much in our own cube is they've just printed so many 3-drops, like Fable and shit like that, Minsc and Boo at 4, that just completely spiral the game out of control in an unreasonable way, like compared to historical Magic for how much they cost. And we deliberately avoid playing cards like that because things that completely snowball the game out of control, that come down on turn 3 in a lot of decks and come down on turn 2 in green decks, it just makes a lot of games just like unfun and over really fast. But yeah, if you're playing shit like that, like playing Essica's Chariot on turn 3 is one of the most insane things you can do, and that's a 4-drop. So you want to move into the density exercise?
Yeah, so I'm going to frame this, and then what I'm going to do is, Chris, I'm going to probably pass this to you mostly because when we did this series the first time for our old podcast, the density experiment was something that you came up with. You had probably the best way of speaking about it, but just to kind of frame what you're talking about here, we know what our colors want to be doing. For example, you're building out a traditional cube. You want to see what kind of cards to put in your white section. You know that you need to support aggro, and you're probably going to have some support for mid-range and control, or at least I should say you're primarily going to support aggro, with mid-range and control being supported in white, but not primary in white. And the question then becomes, I know I need a bunch of white aggressive creatures in my white section. how many am I supposed to play? Or I know that I want white to have some tertiary support for control, which means I'm probably going to play some wraths. How many wraths am I supposed to play? So what Chris is going to walk us through is a density experiment that's going to help you kind of rationalize how many of a traditional kind of effect should you put in a section. And I assume we're going to operate under the assumption that we're working with a 360 card cube, but obviously you can just up all the numbers by a little bit when you go up to 450, 540 and stuff like that. But Chris, hopefully that frames what we want to talk about well enough to get you started, but why don't you go ahead and take it from there?
Totally. So I think using what I call the density exercise, basically what this is like kind of creating a grid and then theorizing like how many type of effects you want to support your decks. So like let's just use white as an example. Let's also assume that in your white section you're interested in a mono white aggro deck being possible. Now you might not be interested in that. Like Andrea Mengucci's take on like the vintage cube is like he plays like a lot more blue cards than anything else. So he only includes enough 1-drops in white and enough 1-drops in red that to be aggro, you basically have to be Boros. But let's say in my cube, I want a mono white aggro deck to be possible. So I'll ask you guys, like, if you're playing mono white aggro, how many 1-drops do you want on average? And like, what's the lower limit of what's acceptable?
6 comes to mind as like, I mean, my minimum probably being 5, but I want 6 good 1-drops, maybe even 7.
For viewers at home, if you're familiar with hypogeometric calculators, I also would have guessed 6. But to put that in context, it gives you about a 70% chance of having a 1-drop in your opening hand, assuming you don't mulch.
So 5 is probably the minimum, like I just barely got there. 6 is okay, but the actual answer is probably closer to like, I want 7 1-drops in my deck to make my mono white aggro deck come together.
Yeah, so if we go to 7, it gets us to about an 80% chance, which I think is pretty reasonable.
So let's land on 7.
Okay. So, I mean, what that means by extension is, like, you want to have at least 6 or 7 white 1-drops in your cube, right? Because otherwise, your mono white player, if you theoretically want one, is just not going to get enough 1-drops to play the deck effectively. And, like, maybe you do something like you play like 6 dedicated aggressive 1-drops, like that's what they do, and then your 7th is like a Thraben Inspector or something that you'll still play in your white aggressive deck, but is fine in white mid-range decks, and like if you're doing blinky stuff, it works there too, or whatever, if that makes any sense, right? Mm-hmm. So let's skip 2-drops. You can think about 2-drops the same way you think about 1-drops, right? Just like think about at like a minimum how many white 2-drops you want, and then you need at least that many. So where the density exercise gets a little bit more interesting is how many white 3-drops do you want? So if you're playing a mono white aggro deck, and you have the ideal curve, how many white 3-drops do you think you'd on average want to play in your like ideally structured mono white deck?
3 to 4?
3, 4, yeah.
Right. So again, what that means by extension is you should probably be playing at least 4 3-drops. But once you get up to the 3-drop level, there are actually some other considerations. So let's say at your table, there's a Boros aggro drafter, and there's like a green-white mid-range drafter. In your Boros aggro deck, if we think you'd probably play 3 or 4, like in your mono white deck, which means kind of by extension, like that's about the limit of 3-drops that you want in your aggro deck, regardless of what color it is. In this theoretical example, like the Boros aggressive player is probably taking 2 to 3 3-drops. But if you're a green-white drafter at the table, maybe let's say in our cube you're playing like a token Z, like kind of mid-range strategy. Like how many 3-drops in total, not white 3-drops, but how many 3-drops in general, like theoretically, do you think you'd want in your deck? Like probably like 5 to 6, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So if you basically want to be in, like have an environment where, let's say mono white just isn't open because there's a multiple people in white, but you can do a 2-color aggro deck, you want enough white 3-drops that you're going to be able to get the number of 3-drops that you want. And you want enough white 3-drops that the other white deck at the table will also be able to get a number of white 3-drops that it wants. So I would say by extension, what that means is you should probably play about 5 to 6 white 3-drops in your cube at that point that are going to be solid upper end cards for your aggressive deck or good mid-cost cards for your white mid-range deck. And what this also means is, like, sometimes there's just, like, a player's just going to get too many white 3-drops because, like, nobody else was in white except the blue-white control drafter who's not interested in any of those. But the point of this exercise is that you have a sufficient number of cards at these various slots that no matter how the draft shakes out, if there's two-color white decks or one single mono-white deck, that there's going to be enough of these high-impact 3-drops that they get the sufficient number that they need. But by the same token, you don't want to include too much more than this, or there's going to be like 2 to 3 white 3-drops that are just languishing in sideboards, whatever the weakest ones are, every single draft, right? So, like, the purpose of this exercise, again, is to make sure that you have sufficient density to make the things that you want to happen, but you don't want to go too much farther over those limits because otherwise there's just going to be more, like, for example, white 3-drops available than, like, anyone is going to want, and they just end up eating up cube space. You get the idea, right? You theorize the structure of your ideal decks and, like, how often you want those decks to be able to appear for a drafter in the draft, and you want to include enough of those effects that a drafter drafting a strategy can get an ideal number of them and not go too much farther than that because you don't want to have a glut of certain type of effects in your section that are eating up cube space and ultimately leaving the weakest cards in those slots languishing in sideboards every single draft. So let's get a little bit more specific. We're still in white. If you're playing a blue-white aggressive deck, how many wraths do you think you want?
Yeah, it's between 0 and 1 in the main board.
Do you mean a control deck? Blue-white control deck? You said blue-white aggro deck.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I mean a blue-white control deck. Like, about how many wraths do you think you'd main board?
2.
0 to 1, and then I want at least 1 in the sideboard. Maybe 2 if I...
So you want access to 2, but the number you main board...
Like, maybe. Different. I want access to at least 1. I wouldn't mind having access to a second, but I want to have access to at least 1. I just don't necessarily main deck it.
Right. So this is like a slot where literally, basically, the only deck that you have to think about is a control deck. If you have a quote-unquote wrath, like Settle the Wreckage, that like a white creature deck might bring in out of the sideboard, then I wouldn't necessarily count that towards the total. I'd say that in my white control decks, I'd probably main 2, and I'd want a 3rd in the sideboard for really heavy creature matchups. So if in my mind, that's the ideal number of wraths for a blue-white control deck to have, and I also understand that these cards are so specific to that deck that, like, nobody else is probably going to take them, I would say you play 3, and if you want to be really certain that you want your blue decks to get the blue-white decks to get the number of wraths that they want, especially if you're playing a wrath like Settle that another player might play, I think we're currently on... How many are we on? We're on 4, right? Or are we just on 3?
I believe we're on
3 in white. Yeah, we play Wrath, Day of Judgment, and Settle. That being said, I will say, Chris, if the Wrath in question is Sunfall, I will put 4 of them in my deck.
Sure.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I like 5 mana win the game, too. Okay, so, like, last example in white. And, like, you'd notice that earlier we were covering, like, the number of sort of proactive drops that you want at each slot for your various decks you want to support to function. Let's move from wraths, which are hyper-specific, to something specifically or substantially more generic. So if there's going to be 2 white drafters at the table, and one of them is really heavily white, how many direct removal spells do you think your, like, heavily white proactive deck is going to want? And, like, how many white removal spells do you think, like, a blue-white controlled drafter at the same table is going to want?
So, proactive deck probably wants, like, 3-ish.
Yeah, 3 sounds good.
4, maybe.
Well, it depends. Like we're talking about main deck, right? Like, I mean, you're probably you're not really like you probably want like 3 and then something that can push damage or like mana tithe or something like that. More interaction, but like direct removal, I think you want about 3. You want to be able to remove like one big creature on a pivotal turn and then be able to kill them.
Yeah. Okay, that seems reasonable to me. So if you're playing like a blue-white deck, like how many pieces of white removal do you think you're gonna play?
Blue-white control. Blue-white control. Yeah,
blue-white control. Sorry, I keep saying.
Yeah. So we're talking like white removal or just interaction in general.
White removal specifically, because like your board removal in blue-white is coming exclusively.
Yeah. So given my position on Wraths, it probably wouldn't surprise you that mine is very, very high. Like pretty much as I can get my hands on.
Okay.
Yeah, 5.
That's fair.
5 sounds like a dartboard number to throw out there.
Okay. And like in a different scenario, if we imagine there are like 2 decks that are like pretty decently white, but not like 75% white, and then there's like another drafter at the table who is playing a little bit of white because it's like not uncommon for 3 drafters to be in the same color in different densities. You'd want like 3 to show up in like one 50-50 deck. You'd want maybe 3 to show up in a different 50-50 deck, maybe less if it's black-white because you just are spoiled for choice in black-white. And then like a green ramp deck splashing white might play like 2, or maybe 3.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think the green-white deck, I would rather just play the green removal, right? Most of it generates value or tempo or whatever. If you're
right.
Like if you're a green-white deck, I mean, unless you're like a base white deck, but we've talked about why that's not likely. I do think this is kind of gets into the green thing, right? Of like the green deck would rather just play more of the fight creatures and stuff like that.
Sure, but I might pack like a Fateful Absence so I can tag a Planeswalker.
Yeah, so like
2
1
or something like that, right?
Yeah,
it's
1.
Right, like 1, maybe 2, right? So when you synthesize all of this, you probably want to play at least 8 white removal spells, generally speaking, right? So this spread of decks, there's like a sufficient amount of white removal that like each of these decks is going to be able to get the number at once, right? If you have at a minimum 8, if you have like a white aggro drafter and like a white support blue drafter, if you have 8, the blue-white deck can get like maybe 5 of them, which would be a good number, and then the more aggressive deck can pack at 3, right? If you play less removal than this, and maybe you want to play a removal light environment because you want it to be about combat math or whatever, but again, we're kind of assuming like a generalist environment. Like, does that sound like enough removal to you guys?
Yeah, 8 removal spells, and we're talking about a spread of like instant / sorcery / Oblivion Ring type effects and things like that.
Right. So Teld just informed me we're running 11. That's partially a function of the fact that we're actually running like a number of really cheap 1-mana interactive spells, so the blue-white control deck can deal with early plays from the aggro deck that like your white aggro deck's probably not going to want, right? The white removal spells you're playing in your white aggro deck, because you don't want to play a ton, because you need to pack your deck with aggressive creatures, you want those removal spells to deal with basically anything.
Yeah, the general rule that kind of applies to retail limited applies here. The more aggressive your deck, generally speaking, the more expensive you want your removal to be, because you're going to spend your early turn playing creatures, and then you'll have free mana available later. And the more controlling your deck is, the cheaper you want your interaction to be, because you want your turn 5 to be playing a Quintorius Loremaster or an Aclazotz, not, just playing we don't run 5-mana removal, but you get my point.
Totally. So, like, in the case of, like, the white removal, we're saying, like, we probably want a minimum of 8 to meet the requirements of the table. But it's not necessarily a bad thing to play a couple more white removal spells, because somebody in the first pack might be speculating that they might be white, and they end up not being white, right? So what you don't want is maybe somebody thinks they're white for the first, like, 3 or 4 picks, like, snaps 2 white removal spells, and then the people who actually end up in white just, like, don't get enough removal, because another person at the table, completely understandably, thought that they might be in white because they first picked a Wandering Emperor or something. So anyway, I think you guys get the point. Even if you're like starting your cube design by just dumping all the cards that you like into a file and then you have to cut from there, like you can use this exercise, or you can use this exercise ground up, identifying how many cards you want for the archetypes that you intend to function is how you should be thinking about this, rather than just being like, I don't know, like these are the 4 white 1-drops that I like, so I'll put these in. You're not going to have an effective white aggro deck if that's all you put in. By the same token, like, you don't want to put in 14 because there's diminishing returns on 1-drops once you've sort of put yourself at a high probability to play one on turn 1, because drawing them later in the game is not good. That's when you kind of want to be drawing your, like, elite spellbinders or your Sarah Paragons or stuff like that when you can afford to cast them, right? So you can apply this to all of your other colors, just thinking about sort of different strategies. Like, obviously, if you're primarily making blue like an aggro control/control color, you don't need to play a bunch of 1-drop creatures, right? In some cases, you might not need to play any at all. What you're really concerned with is, okay, if I have a blue aggro control deck at the table and a blue control deck at the table, how many counter spells do each of these decks need to function? Okay, I should probably be playing at least that many. And this density exercise can apply to themes as well, but again, today we're focused on archetypes. Just like, so make sure you have enough of your bread and butter cards in there.
I was going to say there's another thing of you can always afford to put more cheap cards in a cube. There are diminishing returns on 5 and 6 drops in Modern Magic. So, you know, if you're designing your cube, I do like to throw 500 cards into a file and just like trim things out. Just put all the cards you like into one document and then figure out what you really, really like and trim it down. But I think when in doubt, like if you look at our cube, you know, there's only maybe 1 to 2, 6, 5, 6 mana plays in most of the colors, right? There aren't a lot of expensive things to be doing because the cheap cards do so much now that it's really hard to justify. For example, we just got a 2-drop in the last set called 10th District Hero. And this card is like, functionally speaking, a cheap card and an expensive card. So like, why it limits the value of more expensive cards. Now, some of them are really, really powerful, and you obviously want some number of them because they'll take over a game for your controlling decks. But my point is there really isn't a limit to the number of like 1 to 3 mana cards you're going to want overall. Maybe 3s is where you start getting a little sketchy, but 1 and 2 drops, as long as they're good, you can basically put a near infinite number of them in your cube.
That, and if you're insistent on running like the best possible removal that you can, like if you're just going to put Swords to Plowshares and Doom Blades and Lightning Bolts and stuff like that in your cube, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to run really expensive stuff that dies to that stuff anyway, because then you're just trapping your players into casting 6 drops that trade down for 1 and 2 mana interaction, unless of course they're like Titans and stuff like that. But generic like 6 drops that have to wait a turn to do something, you just don't need those in a cube. First off, you don't need them at all, but also they just stack up very poorly against the very, very cheap interaction that you likely want to play, because cheap interaction makes every deck better.
Yeah, I think about 3 to 4 mana is like the breaking point for stat sticks in Modern Magic. So, for example, in our standard cube, Colossadactyl is low-key one of the best cards in it. And it's a generic 4 mana 4/5 with Reach and Trample. But it turns out that stat line and that set of keywords is extremely powerful. And it doesn't really matter if your opponent will sometimes kill it for 2 mana. The games that they don't have that removal, it takes over the game. So, like, you can have expensive stat sticks, but, like, expensive stat sticks in Magic used to look like 5 drops, and now they're, like, 3 and 4 drops.
Right. So, like, just to kind of give an example of, like, the first iteration of our own cube, and bear in mind this was partially a function of, like, we did not just even have a good density of cheaper cards in the entire card pool, so our hand, if we wanted to play like good cards, was essentially kind of forced here. But our first iteration of the cube had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 4-drops in white, and that's not even counting the fact that we had 2 Boros 4-drops and a Selesnya 4-drop and an Azorius 4-drop. There's just like no way in an ideal curve that the number of white players spread across the table is going to play nearly that many 4-drops, right? So, like, Leonin War Leader was just consistently ending up in sideboards because people would just play the cards that they perceived to be better, right? So we didn't do this exercise when we first designed our cube, and after we played it for a while, like, we had 4 5-drops in black.
That's strong arena cube energy there, is to
yeah,
overload the 4 and 5 drop sections to the point where, like, half the cards, if they're open, just necessarily won't see play that draft.
Right, and actually, it's cool that you mentioned that, because, like, the Arena Cube is, like, a really ridiculous example, and, like, an obvious example of the fact that they're not doing this. So, like, in the last iteration of the Arena Cube, which was 540, I think they were playing the same number of white one drops that we play in our 360. I think it was like 7, but only 360 of those cards even get opened, right? So like reduce that by a percentage, and it just meant that if you're trying to play a white aggressive deck, like on average, if you were lucky, you'd get like 4 if you got lucky, right? And you were more generally going to end up with like 2 or 3.
Yeah, and part of that was like by design, right? They have like some sort of intention there to nerf like the white based aggro decks, but at the same time, if somebody starts on a white aggro deck because you still have some white aggro creatures there in the 1-drop slot, they're just not going to have the density of cards available to them to make that deck consistently work in that environment.
Right, which is another silly way to design, because like if you don't want white aggro decks running over slower decks, don't like waste card space and people's time and lead them down bad paths by like not like playing white aggressive cards, but like not enough of them to make white aggro good. Just like cut white aggro from your cube.
Yeah, like
you know what I'm saying? Like don't lure people into drafting a shitty under-supported deck because you're trying to nerf it. But that's an aside. So anyway, that's my whole monologue on the density exercise. I think if you apply this strategically before you start making cuts or before you start adding cards, you're a lot less likely to end up in a situation where you're drafting and you're just like, Jesus Christ, there are so many white 5-drops going around that nobody needs.
Yeah, kind of building on this, another thing you could do is Chris and I are fond of mock-up decks, especially for Roto. Kind of stop and look sometimes and see, like, if you had the ideal version of a number of different decks, what would they look like, right? And if you consistently find that there's not a deck, like there are cards in your cube that don't have an ideal home, right? Maybe consider, like, are those cards necessary? Now, sometimes it's a matter of you needed that extra card for this archetype to have enough density, and you don't really want to play it, but if you cut it, you're not sure you'll have enough density, right? So that happens a lot with 1-drops. But it can help you, especially with more expensive cards, which should be the big, important, impactful cards. If there's a card that costs 4 or 5 mana in your cube that you're just like, okay, there's no deck, aggro mid-range control of this color that I would be like, excited, this would be a premier card in my deck that I would want in my ideal 23. Maybe you should ask yourself if like that card should actually be in your cube.
Yeah. One more point that I want to like touch on briefly, and then like I'm done because I've been, talking entirely too much and at this point probably boring people. But when you're thinking about like your higher slots, like your 4-drops, right? It's a good idea for this density exercise to think about including cards like for 4-drops that would make like ideal top end, like good top end for an aggro deck, but also do something solid in a mid-range deck that might also want a white 4-drop. So if you have a 5-drop or a 4-drop in red, for example, like Hellrider, like that's exclusively an aggro card. You're not going to put that in most mid-range decks. So that might impact your calculus of how many red 4-drops you even want. If you want to support red as like a support color for mid-range, you want to make sure that on top of that Hellrider, you have a number of other cards that are going to work as top end and aggro, but are also going to go into decks that are not Hellrider decks.
Yeah, we actually replaced Hellrider with Red Cap Gutter Dweller, and I think it kind of falls into this paradigm of like Gutter Dweller it's good in it's at its best in aggro, right? But you will play this card in some of your more aggressively slanted mid-range decks. Sometimes you'll bring it out of the board in your more grindier decks against control opponents because you want some extra card advantage and bodies and stuff. So like there's more play to it than a card like Hellrider that is just only good when you are trying to turn everything on your table sideways.
Yeah, 100%. And that was a result of the exact calculus we were just talking about. We're trying to squeeze as much burn into our red section as we possibly can and kind of push it in the direction of having enough reach once your creatures get bricked, which means you got to cut some top end. So we looked at this and we were like, well, we really only want to play like 3 red 4-drops. So all of those 4-drops should be like a Chandra Torch of Defiance or a Rekindling Phoenix, where you're going to put them in your bigger red decks, but they're also excellent at the top end of your aggro decks. So we didn't have to include as much density of red 4-drops to have enough for aggro and mid-range decks to have access to the number that they would want.
This kind of pushes into what we're going to talk about into the in part 3 whenever we get around to talking about themes. But the more open-ended slots are in your cube, the better. right? The more different decks an individual card can fit into, the better. And one thing I wanted to mention here, you talked about the density experiment and how to like kind of roughly figure out how many removal spells you would want in a given section. Well, that tells you the number that you want, right? We can kind of roughly figure out how many white removal spells we want, but then the question becomes, which removal spells do I pick? And until you get to your themes, if you're just building out your monocolored sections and you're really working from the ground up to build your cube, it really helps out if you just try to keep your removal spells very generic so that basically any kind of deck can play them. So think your Portable Hole, your Oblivion Rings, your Swords to Plowshares, stuff like that. I could see a world where in our Peasant Cube, instead of playing a Lightning Strike, we decided, hey, we really want to play Blitz of the Thunder Raptor, which is like a removal spell that counts the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Well, that's a really thematic thing, right? That's implying that I have some sort of spells matter deck going on in my format, and I wouldn't just put that in my cube until I know for a fact that I have like blue-red spells as a supported archetype. But even then, if I play Blitz of the Thunder Raptor over a Lightning Strike variant or a Royal Eruption or whatever, all I'm doing is taking a slot in the cube that could be generically useful for a lot of different red decks, and I'm making it hyper-specific to one red deck, and for probably not very much upside in that exact case, right? Like the difference between a spells-based removal spell that can deal like 4 or 5 and exile a creature isn't really that much better than a Royal Eruption that can go in any red deck. And this speaks more to like cube equity and stuff like that, where every single slot in your cube matters. But keep your interaction generic. I could see a world where there are some black cubes where black doesn't really want a spell like Bone Shards, for example, which is the black sorcery, discard a card or sack a creature to destroy something. There are some structured black decks that don't really care about that sort of effect. And if that's taken the space of just like a Fatal Push or a Cut Down or something like that, I would say err on the side of playing the generic Fatal Push Cut Down card that's just always going to tag the thing it's there to tag. That way more decks can use that card. And then once you build out your themes, like once you've kind of gone through what we'll talk about in the next episode, and you say, okay, this color pair is kind of doing this thing, or maybe I have this hyper-specific theme in blue-black that cares about sacrificing creatures or discarding cards or whatever, then I might go back and flavor some of the removal to fit specific kind of themes. But as a starting point, keep it generic, keep it kind of ever-present for all the different types of decks that need it.
Yeah, I will say there's some advantage here in sometimes having a specific removal spell for a kind of color or a kind of archetype. So, for example, we run Elspeth's Smite, right? And my aggressive white deck just is never interested in touching that card. But it is a extremely good card for your slower mid-range or control-y decks, and they are very interested in that card. So while that card isn't as generically applicable to every single color, like every single white deck, right? The fact that you're getting a spot for your deck wants a lot of removal to get that, to be able to be sure they can get that density can be helpful when you're but that is more of an archetype thing rather than what you're talking about, which is more of like a thematic thing, trying to fit your removal into a specific color pair more.
Totally. Like Elspeth's Smite actually can still, like removal like Elspeth's Smite can still fit into the density exercise we just talked about by simply asking yourself the question, how fast are the aggro decks in my environment? How many 1-mana conditional removal spells do I want to run in my blue-white control deck to make sure that I don't just die to 1-drops? And then that's the number of your overall removal spells that you want to make cards like Elspeth's Smite or Portable Hole or, cards like that. So that also fits into the density exercise. And another thing to touch on that Tim was kind of like brought on by talking about, making sure that, at least in a good stuff cube, that like most of your cards are just going to play in most of the decks that like fit the intended archetype for them. Once you do the density exercise, like let's say you intend for your white section to be 48 cards in your 360. Once you do the density exercise and you add all of the necessary effects to make all of your decks work, you might find like, oh, look at that. I've got like 4 or 5 slots left to play with. So, like, for example, in our white section, like, we've got all of our bases covered, right? But you end up having a couple of spots left over. And these are good spots for, like, utility lands that aren't quote-unquote playables, but serve purposes in a variety of different decks. Because like once you get enough playables, it's good to start picking utility lands because you're just fitting more functionality into your deck without having to sort of like make cuts. Or play a card like Helping Hand, which is like basically the white Unearth, which is really solid if you have some like engine-y white 3-drops like Welcoming Vampire or things like that that produce consistent value. Like Helping Hand is not necessary for any of your archetypes to work, but because we had all of our bases covered for all of our archetypes, we can play a card like Helping Hand, or like Unearth as an example in black. There's not a single black archetype that needs Unearth, but it's an interesting effect that's really good in certain builds. And like basically, these are what you're going to hear referred to in the Cube community as like flex slots. These are the slots you kind of get to play with once all of your archetype bases are covered. And as I mentioned, I think that those are a really great spot for your utility lands, your Boseijus, your creature lands.
Tim and I's favorite utility land, Lorien Revealed.
Yeah. Or Troll of Khazad-dûm or whatever. And yeah, same goes for like your fixing. You know, if you realize like, oh, I intended to have 48 card sections, but I noticed that all of my sections are filled out even once I've added a couple of flex cards at like 46, you can just play another cycle of fixing lands, which makes every deck function better, right? So just cover your bases and then decide where you can make like little additions that just make your cube play a little bit better once you know how many slots you have to play with.
I do recommend playing at minimum one flying man in any given blue section.
And it should be Lantern Bearer.
It should probably be Lantern
time.
Bearer. You can have a flying men deck. There is a thing. You can have a flying men deck, but
yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next episode with like what kind of themes you might want to achieve in your cube, impacting the numbers we just talked about for like a pure good stuff. Like if you have like ninjas or you want to have a curiosity deck or whatever, obviously you're going to want to do the deck density exercise for like how often am I going to have a flying man on one to start facilitating what my deck is doing or whatever. But we'll be covering that in the next section. How do you guys feel about the episode? Do you think we've covered our bases here? Do we have a sufficient density of talking about the density exercise?
Well, once we add in the conversation about the owl at the end of the episode, I'm pretty sure we're going to have a nice lengthy one.
Yeah, I've got plenty of padding for that one. I mean, just to kind of like wrap up everything we're talking about here, if you got to the end of this episode and you're like, wait, what was the point of this episode again? Archetypes. So like build out your archetypes, build out your monocolored sections, right? We went from having our Build a Cube episode 1 where we're just, laying out the basis of like how many cards should you play in your cube, that sort of thing, like just bare bones foundational basics. Here we're actually starting to add cards to the cube now. We want to support the main archetypes that people expect to see, aggro, control, mid-range. We want to do that by first building out the monocolored sections and leave the thematic stuff to kind of work itself out based on the cards you've chosen for your monocolored sections. We want to make sure that we're supporting kind of the macro archetypes that Magic traditionally supports. Like, we want white to be aggro. We want blue to be control. We want red to be aggro with some control support, that sort of thing. Unless you have a different template in mind, in which case, like, you already know what you're doing. Probably you don't need the support of episodes like this. And then Chris walking through the density experiment was basically to give you an understanding of how to choose or how to select the number of different types of popular effects. If you're trying to figure out how many one-mana dorks to play or how many cantrips to play or how many rafts to play, the density experiment is a good way to just kind of frame that. And it's not like a hard and fast rule either, right? You don't have to necessarily stick to those numbers. You could go +1, -1. You can do whatever you want. It's your cube. But these are the foundational things we think will help you build out a monocolored section. And then in the next episode, we're going to talk about how to take the monocolored section that you've built and kind of mix and match what the color pairs represent to build out your themes. And again, a lot of people go into cubes already knowing what their themes are, and we'll start with the gold section, build out the monocolored section from the gold section, and we like to kind of do it in reverse. Build the monocolored sections and see what gold cards kind of pull everything together, which I'm actually curious, like what the most popular kind of cube building method out there is, but I would imagine the majority of like first timers have really specific gold decks in mind, and then start with those and then just add in monocolored cards that fit that.
That's what you tend to see with like Reddit posts like this is my first cube, and like usually the question is, oh, I can't find a good theme for Simic, like somebody help me think of a Simic theme. And like the short answer is like
Merfolk.
Not every color pair needs a theme, but like we'll talk about that next episode. I think at this point we should probably wrap this one up.
Yeah, long and short of it is just that if you commit to themes early, you're likely to trap yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule. You can do whatever you want to be a cube, but this is just how we like to approach things. This is how we've approached building like our peasant cube or unrestricted cube, so on and so forth. But with all that being said, thanks to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, all things Magic. There's currently some tier lists of draftable Magic the Gathering sets that people have been engaging with. If you want to give your take on what the best arena sets are, or draftable sets on arena are,
it's Neon Dynasty. There's you don't need to really go into it.
there's some strong opinions, but that's the fun of doing it. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We have scheduled drafts 4 days a week. We do our unrestricted cubes on Sunday and Wednesday nights. We do our peasant cube drafts on Saturday nights. We have an F&M style Friday night draft where the players vote from a pre-selected group of cubes. And then we have various Jank Diver Gaming cubes or user-submitted guest cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings. And those are kind of our flex slots where we get to show off a lot of different things that our community works with. You can check out our socials. Twitter at Jank Diver Gaming. Find us on YouTube. Type in Jank Diver Gaming. It'll bring you to us. Twitch.tv/Teld Talks, where you can find Teld talking about Magic the Gathering and playing some of our cubes. We will eventually get to part 3. It will not be our very next episode, but part 3 of the Build a Cube series will be about thematic and gold sections. We reserve the right to do that episode whenever we feel like doing it, and then we'll build out the series. And we do have Thunder Junction coming up. Probably not episode, but the next episode, but I think the following one after that will be our Thunder Junction review. But with that being said, the yeehaw, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll catch y'all next time. So Teld, I've still got you on the line. Chris actually had to bolt to take his dog out. I had a different sign-off ready, but since I've got just you here, I have a sign-off that I've been waiting for just a separate kind of like either just me and you or me and Chris. I'm going to pit you guys against each other on something. And since I just have you here, I'm going to go ahead and do your half of it now. And then for the next sign off, I'll let Chris do his half. Okay. So you might remember we recorded an episode. I think it was actually the Build a Cube series part 1 that never got released because the audio messed up. But at the end of that episode, I had a competition between you and Chris where you may remember, I think, you won the title of Nomenclature Norman, a very prestigious timing.
And I believe Chris actually won that.
Maybe Chris did.
I fumbled the ball there at the end, yeah.
Okay, well, you both are going to get a separate opportunity to reclaim that. For those who didn't listen to the episode, which is everybody because it didn't get released, the way this worked was I said a name, a legendary creature's name, and I required Teld and Chris to tell me the entire name of that card. I'm going to do that here with Teld, and I'm going to see how many he scores. And then on the next sign-off, I'm going to get Chris to do the same exact batch of cards and see who wins the title of Nomenclature Norman. And I will say there may or may not be some strings involved with this one. So sorry in advance, but are you ready?
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so... You're probably gonna catch on to this pretty quickly, but your first legendary creature's name is Thalia.
Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, or Thalia, Heretic Cathar? Or Thalia and the Gitrog monster?
I just need an answer. I can't clarify anything.
Thalia, Guardian of Thraben.
Ooh, sorry. The answer was actually Thalia and the Gitrog monster. We'll see if Chris gets that one, though, so sorry about that one. Your next legendary creature's name is Ulamog.
Infinite Gyre or Ceaseless Hunger? Infinite Gyre.
That's really close, but it's actually Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Not bad, though. Not bad, like, valiant effort. I can clarify on this next one that the creature I'm talking about is a Siren Pirate, but the name of the creature is Malcolm.
Keen-Eye Navigator.
Oh, it's actually Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel, but it was really a toss-up there. It was a 50-50 toss-up, and you're doing a great job. Like, you're just off by so much. Your fourth out of fifth, like, we really need to get a point here. Your fourth one is going to be Breaches.
Nimble Pilferer.
That's actually not the name of a Breaches card at all, so... There's no...
Is that not... Or is it... No, it's Eager Pillager, isn't it?
Breaches Eager Pillager is the correct name of a Breaches card, but unfortunately, the one we were looking for was Breaches Brazen Plunderer. And the last one here...
AI-generated titles just keep...
And I have to imagine you get this one because I know it's associated with one of your favorite cards, but your last one is Kogla.
Kogla and Yadaro!
I would love to give it to you, but it's actually Kogla the Titan Ape. So, I mean...
over 5.
Yeah, I mean, big strikeout there. Like, I don't know. I thought you would get at least one of them. And, all right, well, thanks for humoring me. I clearly there was nothing rigged about this at all.
No, I'm sure Chris will have an equal and fair treatment about it.
Tell you what, I'll give you bonus points if you can tell me the creature type on Kogla and Yadaro.
It is a dinosaur monkey, I believe.
It's actually an ape dinosaur turtle.
Ape dinosaur turtle. God bless. You think I'd know that given how much I love that card? I remember talking about it the other day. I just remember Big Monkey, Big Dinosaur doing WWE moves, okay?
Apparently turtles in there.
I guess Yadaro is like a dinosaur turtle, but like,
Probably
does anyone really care?
turtle.
I mean, that card's so sweet.
Yeah. Just for the record, the sign off I was going to do was going to be a big homage to Arboreal Grazer finally getting the sloth creature type.
I mean, it's going to be good before it gets banned for, enabling the free cultivate, right?
Yeah. Oh, man, they added sloth. I guess there was a Fallout card that is a sloth, so they're like, okay, now we have to errata sloths. But as a small little thing that happened because of this, there's this card called Dogged Detective that came out in like a Streets of New Capenna Commander set. It's called Dogged Detective. It's just a human rogue. And they did not errata it to a detective. They said they would not be changing it to a detective. But in the Fallout set, they made a card called Sophia Dogged Detective. It literally has the same goddamn name as the other Dogged Detective, and this one is a human detective. They're like, no, we're not changing that other Dogged Detective to a detective. So it's just like,
this is the Cryptic Caves scampering surveyor fiasco all over again.
Yeah, just, oh man, like... Why are we adding sloth to the game, but we're not going to change Dogged Detective to a detective? It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, that was going to be the sign-off. But next time, remind me, Chris is going to get the same batch of legendaries, and we're going to see how he does by comparison. All he has to do is get one right, and he's automatically nomenclature Norman. So, until we play the game again,
No more owl-related content.
Hey, Tank.
I've uploaded myself into the internet.
Jundy Jund.
Further proof that nothing good happens after midnight.
Which probably means we touch the same chickens at some point, but...
But I will say, my pants stayed dry.